Imagine this: a small, quiet church where everyone knows each other, a pastor who is loved and respected, and a wife who carries the image of a devoted first lady. But behind closed doors, secrets were burning. The night it all came crashing down, the pastor walked into a scene that no one could have ever imagined. His wife, in bed with a trusted church member. What he did next would shock the entire congregation and leave a stain that could never be erased. This is not just a story of betrayal. It is a chilling reminder of how trust can turn into tragedy in the blink of an eye. You're watching Dark Motives, where we dive deep into real cases that shake communities to their core. If you love true crime stories that keep you on the edge of your seat, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an episode. And before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories reach across the world. Now let's get into tonight's case, a story that begins with a faithful congregation, a respected pastor, and a betrayal that would spark whispers, outrage, and heartbreak far beyond the church walls. Our story takes us to Jackson, Mississippi, a city known for its strong faith, gospel roots, and deep sense of community. In a modest neighborhood stood a small but growing church that many considered a second home. The pastor, Reverend Charles Miller, was admired not just for his sermons but for the way he carried himself as a man of faith. His wife, Denise, was seen as the backbone of the ministry, always smiling, always present, and always supporting her husband's mission. To the outside world, they looked like the perfect couple leading the perfect church family. Members often said they wanted their marriages to be just like theirs. But behind those church doors, things were not as perfect as they seemed. Whispers began to rise about late-night meetings, secret phone calls, and a closeness between Denise and a trusted male member of the congregation that didn't look so innocent. At first, the pastor brushed off the rumors, refusing to believe that his wife could betray him. But soon the truth would hit him harder than any sermon ever could. At first, Reverend Miller dismissed the quiet gossip floating around his congregation. He had built his entire life on faith, trust, and loyalty, and to imagine that his own wife could betray him felt unthinkable. But soon, cracks began to show. Denise started pulling away, missing small evening prayers at home, and spending longer hours at the church even when there was no scheduled event. The excuses were subtle, but for a man who had studied people for years from the pulpit, he couldn't ignore the shift in her behavior. It wasn't just her absence that troubled him. There were the late-night phone calls, the sudden silence when he entered a room, and the way she guarded her phone like it contained holy scripture. At first, he tried to rationalize it. Maybe she was planning something special for the church. Maybe she was counseling a troubled member. Maybe it was all in his head. But every day, his instincts told him something darker was brewing. One evening during Bible study, he noticed her exchanging glances with a man named Anthony Reed, a longtime church member who had been close to the family for years. Anthony was always respectful, always dependable, and someone Reverend Miller trusted like a brother. But that night, there was something different in the way Anthony looked at Denise, something that made the pastor's stomach twist in knots. It wasn't just a friendly look. It was the look of a man hiding something. The more Reverend Miller observed, the more the pieces started to connect. Denise volunteered to work closely with Anthony on church projects, often insisting it was best for the ministry. She would return home later than expected, offering vague explanations that didn't match the clock. The pastor began to lose sleep, his mind replaying the subtle signs he had ignored for too long. Every sermon he gave about truth and integrity began to feel like a heavy weight pressing down on him, because deep inside he feared his own house was no longer built on those same values. Still, he wasn't ready to confront her without proof. He needed to know for certain, no matter how much it tore him apart. And as the days passed, Reverend Miller's quiet suspicion grew into an unshakable certainty. Something was happening right under his roof, and soon, he would discover the truth in the most devastating way possible. It was a Friday night in Jackson, Mississippi, the kind of night when most families were settling in, preparing for a quiet weekend. Reverend Miller had just returned from a late counseling session with a young couple in the congregation. He expected to find Denise at home, perhaps preparing for the Saturday outreach program. But when he walked through the front door, the house was dark and silent. No television, no sound from the kitchen, no familiar footsteps. Something felt off immediately. At first, he tried to calm himself. Maybe Denise had gone to visit her sister. Maybe she was at the store. But then, a thought struck him. Her car was still parked outside. That detail gnawed at him. She was inside the house, yet nowhere to be seen. Slowly, he began moving down the hallway, each step heavy with dread, his heart pounding like a drum in his chest. As he reached their bedroom door, he noticed it was slightly ajar. A faint glow of lamplight spilled out into the hallway. He froze, straining his ears, and that was when he heard it. Soft voices, muffled laughter, and then a sound that confirmed his worst nightmare. Reverend Miller's chest tightened, and in that moment denial was no longer an option. Pushing the door open, the scene that greeted him would burn into his memory forever. There, tangled in his own sheets, was Denise, the woman he had vowed to spend his life with. And beside her, half-hidden but unmistakable, was Anthony Reed, the man he had trusted like family. For a moment, time stood still. The pastor couldn't move, couldn't speak, as the image seared itself into his mind. When Denise realized he was standing there, her face drained of color. Anthony scrambled, stammering words that made no sense. The betrayal hit Reverend Miller like a physical blow, so heavy it nearly dropped him to his knees. Everything he had built, his marriage, his ministry, his faith in people, collapsed in an instant. And what he did in the next few seconds would determine whether this remained a private scandal or exploded into something that the entire city of Jackson would never forget. For a moment, silence filled the room, thick and unbearable. Reverend Miller's hands trembled as he gripped the doorframe, his eyes locked on the two people he thought he could trust the most. Denise tried to cover herself, stuttering his name, but the pastor's stare cut through her like a blade. Anthony sat frozen, unable to move, the shame written across his face. The pastor's voice finally broke through, low and trembling, but filled with a rage he had never felt before. "In my house, in my bed. How could you?" Each word shook the room, each syllable heavy with pain. Denise begged him to listen, to calm down, to understand, but her words sounded hollow against the reality of what he had just witnessed. Anthony tried to speak, but the pastor's hand shot up, silencing him instantly. Tears welled in Denise's eyes as she pleaded, "It was a mistake. Please, it's not what it looks like." But the pastor laughed bitterly, the sound more frightening than his anger. "Not what it looks like? You are lying in my bed with a man I called brother. Do you take me for a fool?" His voice rose, echoing through the house like a sermon turned into a curse. Anthony finally found the courage to stand, fumbling for his clothes, muttering apologies that fell flat in the tension-filled room. Reverend Miller stepped closer, his fists clenched, his entire body shaking with the weight of betrayal. For a second, Anthony feared the pastor might strike him, and Denise rushed between them, crying and begging him to stop. The room was no longer just a bedroom. It was a battlefield of emotions, shame, and broken trust. The pastor's face was wet with tears now, his anger colliding with heartbreak. He turned to his wife, his voice breaking. "I gave you everything, my name, my heart, my life. And this is how you repay me?" Denise fell to her knees, sobbing. But the pastor's eyes no longer saw her as the woman he married. In that moment, he saw only betrayal. And deep inside, something inside him began to snap. What he chose to do next would determine how this story ended, and whether it would be remembered as a scandal or a tragedy. Reverend Miller stood frozen, his chest heaving, his mind spinning in a storm of rage and despair. He had delivered countless sermons on forgiveness, on patience, on turning the other cheek. But in that moment, none of those words mattered. The image of his wife in another man's arms was carved deep into his soul, and every breath he took felt like fire burning through his chest. Anthony edged toward the door, his hands raised slightly as if to show he meant no harm. But that only fueled the pastor's fury. "You think you can just walk out of my house after this?" His voice thundered. The raw power in his tone made Anthony stop in his tracks. Denise tried to stand, her sobs choking her words as she pleaded with her husband to calm down. But the more she begged, the more he felt the betrayal cutting deeper, as if every plea was another twist of the knife. Reverend Miller's eyes darted around the room, landing on a heavy Bible that sat on the nightstand. It was a symbol of his faith, a book he had carried through countless battles of life. Now, it mocked him. The weight of his broken vows, his shattered marriage, and his humiliated pride pushed him closer to the edge. His fingers brushed against the Bible, but instead of peace, all he felt was anger. Anthony took another step, whispering, "Pastor, please, I never meant for this to happen." The words were weak, trembling, and only worsened the wound. Miller's voice cracked as he shouted, "You betrayed me in the worst way possible. You destroyed my family, my church, my life." The walls of the house seemed to shake with his fury, as if the foundation itself could not hold the storm raging inside him. Denise dropped to her knees again, clutching her husband's legs, crying out that she still loved him, begging him to forgive her. But the pastor's eyes had grown cold, his spirit darkened by the weight of betrayal. And in that terrifying silence that followed, it became clear, this was no longer just a confrontation. This was the moment when grief and anger were about to turn into something irreversible. The air in the room was suffocating, thick with fear and desperation. Anthony stood frozen near the dresser, Denise clung to her husband's legs, and Reverend Miller trembled with a fury he could no longer contain. His mind was split in two, one side screaming at him to walk away, the other urging him to make them feel the same pain that was tearing through his soul. That second voice was louder. With a sudden burst of rage, Miller shoved Denise aside, his eyes burning into Anthony. "You were supposed to be my brother," he growled, stepping forward. Anthony's back hit the wall, panic flashing across his face. He stammered apologies, his hands raised in surrender. But the pastor's anger drowned out every word. The betrayal was too deep, too raw, too consuming to ignore. Reverend Miller's hand darted to the top drawer of the nightstand, pulling out the small revolver he kept for protection. The sight of the weapon sent Denise into screams, her hands shaking as she begged him to stop. Anthony's eyes widened, his chest heaving as he whispered, "Please, Pastor, don't do this." But the gun was already pointed at him, Miller's finger trembling on the trigger. The moment felt like it lasted forever. The ticking of the clock on the wall, the sound of Denise's sobs, the heavy breathing in the room, all of it blurred into a single heartbeat. And then, the silence was shattered. A deafening crack echoed through the house as the gun went off, the bullet tearing through the air. Anthony collapsed instantly, his body crumpling against the wall before sliding lifeless to the floor. Denise screamed, her voice piercing the night, but Miller stood motionless, the gun still in his hand, smoke rising from the barrel. His eyes were wide, his face pale, as the reality of what he had done began to sink in. The room no longer felt like his home. It felt like a crime scene. And as the weight of his actions pressed down on him, the pastor realized his life, his ministry, and his freedom had just ended in a single, irreversible moment. The echo of the gunshot still lingered in the air as Denise collapsed beside Anthony's body, screaming uncontrollably. Blood stained the bedroom carpet, a sight so shocking that she could hardly breathe. Reverend Miller dropped the gun onto the bed, his hands shaking violently. His ears rang, his heart pounded, and yet the world around him felt strangely silent. He had just taken a life, not as a man of faith, not as a husband, but as a man consumed by betrayal. In a panic, Denise scrambled to her feet and ran for the phone, dialing 911 with trembling fingers. Through sobs, she cried out for help, her words barely coherent as she tried to explain what had happened. Reverend Miller stood in the corner, his body stiff, his eyes staring blankly at the wall. He didn't try to stop her. He didn't run. He simply whispered to himself, "What have I done?" Over and over again, as if the words could undo the reality before him. The sound of sirens grew louder in the distance, a chilling reminder that the world outside was about to collide with the nightmare inside. Neighbors had already heard the scream and the gunshot, and some had rushed out onto their porches. For years, the Millers' home had been a place of respect, where church members often visited for prayer. Tonight, it was a house of horror, the site of a scandal that would soon make headlines across Jackson and beyond. When the police arrived, the sight was grim. Officers rushed into the bedroom, finding Anthony Reed lifeless, Denise hysterical, and Reverend Miller standing in silence, his hands raised as if surrendering to more than just the law. The man who once preached forgiveness and salvation was now the center of a crime scene, his congregation's faith about to be tested in ways they had never imagined. The news of the pastor's arrest spread through Jackson like wildfire. Headlines captured the shocking fall from grace. Respected pastor charged with murder. The congregation was split. Some stood by him, insisting he had simply snapped under unbearable betrayal. Others turned away in disgust, unable to reconcile the man they once called shepherd with the accused standing in handcuffs. The church pews that were once filled with hope were now filled with whispers and judgment. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was heavy. Denise sat with her head bowed, her face pale from sleepless nights. The prosecution painted Reverend Miller as a man who had let pride and rage consume him. They emphasized that Anthony Reed was unarmed, that this was not an act of self-defense, but a deliberate choice fueled by jealousy and betrayal. The defense argued that he was a broken man, driven past the point of reason, a man who lost everything in a single night. When Denise took the stand, her voice cracked as she described the events leading up to the shooting. Her tears filled the courtroom, but they could not wash away the image of Anthony lying dead on the bedroom floor. Jurors watched closely as Reverend Miller sat quietly, his eyes lowered, showing the weight of a man who knew his life's mission had been destroyed. After days of testimony, the jury returned with their verdict. Guilty. The judge's voice was steady as he handed down the sentence. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. The pastor who once preached about redemption and eternal life would now spend his own life behind bars. And as he was led away in chains, the only sound in the courtroom was Denise's muffled sobs and the quiet gasp of those who could not believe what had become of their pastor. The story of Reverend Charles Miller is more than a tale of betrayal. It is a chilling reminder of how quickly trust can be broken, how anger can consume a man, and how one choice in the heat of emotion can destroy everything built over a lifetime. A respected leader, a trusted friend, and a marriage that once looked unshakable, all ended in tragedy. As the years pass, people in Jackson still whisper about that night, the night when love, loyalty, and faith collided with jealousy and rage. Some see it as a warning, others as a tragedy that could have been prevented. But one thing remains certain: this story leaves scars that no sermon can erase. What do you think about this case? Was it pure weakness in the face of betrayal, or was the pastor's reaction something that no man could have controlled? Share your thoughts in the comments, and let us know where in the world you're watching from. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. If you found this story gripping, make sure you subscribe to Dark Motives and turn on the notification bell so you never miss the next case. Until then, stay safe, stay alert, and remember, behind every smile, there can be secrets darker than you imagine.